Hi everyone. Last time I explained why Korea's economic development was called a miracle. I showed some scientific evidence on it. For example, Korea's GDP per capita increased so fast and so much for more than half century. At the same time, I told some other statistics showing the improvement of the people's living condition of Korea, their life expectancy, amount of meat consumption, and the number of passenger cars have substantially increased for these years. Today, I like to overview the development process of Korean economy. In particular, I will show the changes of industrial structure of Korea for the past decade. It means how Korea's industrial structure has upgraded for these years. Back to 1950s and early 20s, right after Korean War, Korea was one of the low-income countries in the world. As seen in this figure, Korea's GDP per capita was the lowest one in some 13 countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Europe. At the time, Korea's main industry was the traditional one, like many other developing countries, the farming industry. Particularly, rice farming was the most important one in Korea. For more than 1,000 years, providing enough rice was the most important assignment for the government or rulers. At the time, Kim was responsible for it. This figure shows the composition of industrial production of Korea since 1960 to current days. 1955, the production of agricultural industry amounted to 41.61% of total GDP. That of the manufacturing industry to only 10.3%. The service industry did 38.8%. However, in 1980, the production of manufacturing industry took over 24.7%. That of the service industry took the 48%. Agricultural one did only 16%. Since the 2010, the ratios of service industry and manufacturing industry remains about 60% and 30%. Agricultural industry took only less than 2%. It does mean that industrial structure of Korea has completely changed for these years. Overall, Korea has succeeded in transforming its industrial structures from a traditional agricultural-based one to the modern service-based one. What did happen? How could it happen? It's a very important question. Before asking this question, I'd like to show it from the different perspective, employment perspective. Let's look at the statistics on employment by industry of Korea from 1965 to today. It tells how the major working places or job of Koreans has also changed for these years. In 1965, 58.6% of the labor force in Korea was in the agricultural industry. Those of manufacturing and service ones counted only 9.4% and 28.1% in respect. It means that the most common jobs of Koreans at the time was the farmers living in the countryside. 6 out of the 10 workers were farmers. They were less educated and low-income manual workers. In the rice paddy, from the early in the morning to the late night, everything was done by their own work. Modern farming equipment, such as tractor or truck, was not available to them. Their production heavily depends upon the weather conditions. Frequent drought or flooding disturbed their lives. Their average lifespan was less than 60 years. However, today, everything has changed. The ratio of farmers only take to 5.6%. Those of the manufacturing and service one take 16.2% and 70.8% respectively. In other words, 7 out of 10 workers in Korea are working in the service industry. In particular, jobs on the sector of computer programming, banking and finance, research and development, biosector, these are getting more attention from the people. Currently, the symbol of Korea are modern buildings and sophisticated electronic machine and techniques. But in 60 years ago, it was not. If you look at the manufacturing industry production by sectors, you will see it more clearly. I classify the production of manufacturing industry into 4 sectors. Number 1 is the labor-intensive sectors. Number 2 is the petrochemical and non-metal sectors. Number 3 is the metal, electronics, and machinery sectors. Number 4 is other sectors. The labor-intensive sector is made of 3 subsectors: food and beverage product, textile and leather product, and wood and paper product. The petrochemical and non-metal sectors and the metal, electronic, and machinery sectors include the sectors producing chemicals, iron and steel, automobile, and electronics. We may say that these 2 sectors are representing the capital-intensive and technology-intensive sectors. The other sectors are counted very little, so that I will focus on labor-intensive sectors and capital and technology-intensive sectors only. Economic theory suggests that labor-intensive sector is a low value-added sectors, while the capital and technology-intensive sectors are high value-added sectors. So if any country wants to raise its income of the people or raise its living standard, it should change its industrial structures from low value-added one to the high value-added one. In other words, from a labor-intensive sector to the capital and technology-intensive sectors. Now it's time to check the Korea's production of manufacturing industry by sectors for the past years. The figure shows the production of 4 sectors of manufacturing industry from 1960 to the 2019. It clearly shows the ratio of labor-intensive sector has fallen, but the petrochemical and non-metal sector and metal, electronic, and machinery sector rose for years. For example, the ratio of production of labor-intensive sectors took 70.9% of total manufacturing production in 1960. Petrochemical and non-metal sectors amounted only 14%, and metal and electronics and machinery sectors took only 13% respectively. So the major product in the manufacturing industry came from labor-intensive sectors. We may say that it represents a standard type of industrial structure of a low-income country. However, 2019, the production of a labor-intensive industry took only 11.3%. The production of the petrochemical and non-metal sector, metal, electronic, and machinery sector took the 21% and 65.3%. It means that metal, electronics, and machinery sector became the most important sector in the manufacturing industry in Korea. In other words, it tells that Korea has succeeded in upgrading its industrial structures. Actually, it turns from low valued one to high valued one, or from labor intensive one to the capital and technology intensive ones. What does the changes of this composition of industrial structure mean to the life of the people? Does this transformation of industrial structure actually change the life of the people? Actually, it means a lot. In early days of development, most factory workers are manual workers. For example, women workers in the garment factory had to work with their sewing machines from the early in the morning to the late night. Workers in the wig factory had to spend more than 12 hours to make handmade wigs. Believe it or not, The wig export took almost 10% of total export of Korea in 1970s. Most of these workers were from the countryside with only a few years of education. They stayed in the small dormitory room near the factory and managed their lives by themselves. Their living condition was not good from today's viewpoint, but it was far better than those of their friends and relatives in their hometown. Most of them had to send some of their income regularly to their family because their family members in hometown is in a much worse condition. Surprisingly, the large number of them attended night school provided by the company, and most of them were able to get the high school graduation degree later. Men's life was not different at all. They worked in the construction sites across the country all day long. More than 12 hours of hard working is quite common at that time. Today, everything has changed in Korea. Most of the people work in the service industry. Main jobs are computer software engineers, bankers, or office workers, or maybe some researchers, academicians, and blah. 50 hours of working hours are commonly observed. Let me explain these changes of industrial structure of Korea by showing major product of one of the global company in Korea. Today, everyone in the world knows the name of the company called Samsung or Samsung Group. Samsung Group is made of many companies. One of the famous ones today is Samsung Electronics. Samsung Electronics is making one of the best cell phones in the world. It is also producing the largest share of the computer memory in the world. We may say that Samsung Electronics is the main engine of the Samsung Group. But in the old days, it was not the same. Then you may ask, what was the main product or main company of Samsung Group in old days in 1960s and 70s? Believe it or not, one of the major products of the Samsung was a textile and garment in 1960s and 70s. They produce and export shirt and blouse and suit and skirt. For example, Jade Industry, one of the major companies in Samsung Group, had been the leader of the high school uniform market for a long time. Their school uniform, called Elite, was the most famous brand among high school students. Another important cash cow business of the Samsung Group was selling sugar and wheat. Korea was short of the food at the time. As a result, importing the wheat from the foreign country was one of the important businesses. In addition, sugar farming was not possible in Korea. Therefore, all the sugar consumed in Korea were imported from the foreign country. Samsung has some monopoly power in the market of sugar and wheat at the time. And as a result, it was able to get some extra profit. Samsung Electronics was not an important business at the time. The important fact is that Samsung was able to change its main businesses from garment and sugar businesses to a more advanced one, such as electronic or machinery. It was a very uncommon thing to be observed in the developing country. I may say it's a kind of miracle. A company making t-shirts and blouses and become a company to lead a global electronic market within a half century. Today, I explain how Korea was able to raise its income for the past half centuries. It is because Korea was able to change its industrial structures from a low value added labor intensive industry to a high value capital and technology intensive industry. In other words, sustainable development of Korea can be explained by the success of transformation of industrial structures for a long time. Next time, I try to explain how Korea was able to transform its industrial structure. What was the strategy? See you next time.